Okay, if excuse me, if everybody could take a seat, we're going to get started. We're going to start the presentation, and I'll explain a little bit more detail with the maps on the walls. Just a couple housekeeping items. Hopefully everybody is signed in the back. There's also additional sign-up sheets up on the wall. This is for individual meetings with me at a later date to discuss your property individually. If you can't get any answers today that satisfy you, I guess we can always have a separate meeting. I will go through the maps on the walls. I'm sure it's a little confusing with all the different information up there, but I will go through those as the presentation goes on. And then afterwards, if I'll be here all day, so if you want to wait in line or talk to me, you can ask me questions about your personal property at that point. I might not be able to give you 100% answers, but I can at least guide you to some of the more basic questions, whether your property's in or out of the floodplain. So why are we doing this? We're doing this every 15 or so years. FEMA is updates their maps for the floodplain, and this is the year 2024. Our last one was done in 2007. We presented some information to our Common Council at a meeting several months ago, and they suggested we have an open house to kind of explain to the residents what's going on so they're aware. And so that's why we're here today. This is an informational meeting. This will kind of start with this floodplain basics, and we'll get into some a little more details with regard to the maps and the ordinance. So my name is Jack Zader. I'm the Assistant Director of Community Development for the city and also the Certified Floodplain Manager. If you have any questions, you can ask them. If you want to, you can ask me if you have specifics about a specific topic I'm on, but if you have general questions, you can please wait till the end of the presentation. Again, so we're going to talk a little bit about the floodplain itself, the flood insurance program, the basics of it, and then some more information about other communities in Wisconsin, how they're participating, and then we'll get into the meat of the update of the map and the ordinance, and then I'll take any questions from that point on. So floodplain, many of you probably are aware of this. If you're along the river, you'll understand the difference, but the 100-year floodplain is what people typically call it, and that is actually known as the 1% or greater chance of flooding in any given year, and that's comprised of two sections. There's a floodway and then a flood fringe. The floodway, at least in Wisconsin, is basically the path of flowing water during a flood event. And then the flood fringe is the area where excess water will store or backwater. And there's two parts of the flood fringe. There's the AE and the A zones. AE is what's called a modeled flood zone, and A zone is unmodeled, which AE means basically there's a flood elevation associated with that designation. So it's relatively easy to determine your location in the floodplain or not, because it's all based on elevation data. This is what basically the firm maps I have up here. These are my copies, so please, we lost a few this morning at our presentation, so please don't take those maps. But this is kind of a blow up of what a firm map looks like, and it shows all the different levels of detail on the firm map. So the A zone is, again, that's without a base flood elevation. So those are approximate areas, and we make a determination on what that elevation is based on contours of the surrounding area. The shaded zone X, that's the 500-year floodplain. That's non-regulatory. So if you're in that area, you're not required to have flood insurance. You're not regulated by any of our ordinances regarding floodplain, but it's just kind of a informational piece to let you know that you are in a 500-year floodplain. The base flood elevation, again, that's the elevation that's determined by the profiles in the flood insurance study to determine what the elevation for the flooding is in Mequon. Zone AE, again, that's the 100-year floodplain based on the modeling, and then there's base flood elevations associated with that. The floodway, again, is the crosshatched area, and then there's a unshaded zone X. I have the maps up on the wall. The long three maps are just slices of the city. Those show the proposed maps. The hatched area is the floodway. The dark red is the AE zone, and then the light red is the A zone. There's also a blue portion on the last map. That's our little Menominee section, which I'll get into a little bit later. These other four maps have specific information on, which I'll get to when we get to that part of the presentation. So again, the National Flood Insurance Act that was passed in 1968, it required flood insurance for people that participated in the program. The intent of it was to protect property owners and to reduce future flood damage. Now, I think there's a lot of people that feel that half that's true, but I think from what we've seen over the years, there's been a lot more flood damage and a lot more claims by FEMA, and I think that's one of the issues that people are grappling with, is how to pay for all these flood claims that are going on in areas that are in the floodplain that are being developed. Again, FEMA produces the firm maps, which is here. These are hard copies of the maps. The digital versions are up here, but these are all part of the firm maps that FEMA has produced with help from the DNR. Again, flood regulations, communities must adopt the flood maps and maintain minimum FEMA construction requirements to their local zoning regulations. If we want to be part of the program, we have to do that. We don't really have a choice. And then we're allowed to be participating in the NFIP, which means you get flood insurance through the federal government. And finally, the DNR is the agent for FEMA in Wisconsin. They're the ones that are involved in the modeling of the floodplain. They're the ones involved in the creation of the model ordinance, and they're allowed to be more restrictive than FEMA, and in many cases in Wisconsin, they are more restrictive than FEMA. Again, this is not a mandatory program. The impacts of not participating: you will not be able to get federally backed mortgages. You are not allowed federal disaster assistance. Again, Wisconsin Dells Lake Delton flood is a big example. The city of village of Lake Delton chose not to be a participating member of the flood insurance program in 2008 because they felt their maps were inaccurate, and when they had that large flood, most of the people that were involved in that did not have any coverage for flood insurance and were basically on their own to protect their properties. And you're also ineligible for certain grants that are backed by FEMA. This is just a map you probably had tried to read up there. This kind of shows some of the larger events that took place over the years. We had a number of hurricanes that caused a lot of damage and a lot of insurance claims. So FEMA has been kind of grappling with how to pay for all these claims without costing too much in terms of insurance premiums for the homeowners. This kind of just shows our relationship. So Mequon, we regulate development through zoning. The DNR is our state rep, and then FEMA is the federal rep, and we kind of all work together. There's basically a symbiotic relationship between the three groups. I don't typically deal with FEMA very often. We do get LOMAs, which is a letter of map amendment, which I'll kind of explain a little bit later, directly from FEMA, but most of our work is involved through the DNR with regard to the ordinance and the regulations. So this is flood insurance basics. I won't go into a lot of this, but basically it just says that you're allowed to be covered up to $250,000 from FEMA under their federally backed insurance. You can also get private insurance on the open market for additional coverage. In some cases it's more expensive, some cases it's less expensive. It all depends on the risk of that individual property. What it doesn't cover is water that falls from the sky is covered from your home insurance, or same with broken pipes or sewer backflow. Those are covered by your homeowner's insurance policy and not covered by flood insurance. So I talked a little bit about this before. These are all the acronyms, which you don't probably want to know about too much, but these are the different ways to get out of flood insurance. So if you're in a flood zone, which is a AE zone, and your elevation is higher, you can get what's called a letter of map amendment. That allows you to get out of flood zone. And one of the changes to our proposed ordinance is that if you're out of the flood zone, you're completely out of requirements from FEMA and as the state and as the city. In the old days, in the past, you could get out of the federal requirements, but you were still in the state requirements, and that's changed now with our new ordinance. And now if you have a LOMA, you're not required to abide by our regulations with regard to floodplain development. These examples are a letter of map revision. This is usually typically if somebody fills a property around their house and raises the elevation up, to get a letter of map revision on fill. And then there's a LOMA, it should be LOMA, not FOMA, sorry, for floodway properties. It's the same concept. So to participate, again, you have to adopt the maps and the ordinance that meet FEMA's minimum requirements. In Wisconsin, we have 105 communities that do not participate, and 60 of those communities do not have floodplain in their communities. So they chose to take the risk for their residents and say, we're not going to participate, and everybody that has floodplain property will have to get their own insurance through the open market. 560 communities do participate, and 11 communities were suspended either for not adopting the local maps or the updated maps, or for not complying with the regulations of the ordinance. So 2024 map update. So our last maps, as I said before, were done in 2007. Prior to that, it was 1991. These maps will have to be adopted by July 31st, else we'd be suspended from the program. The model ordinance, same thing, must be adopted by July 31st. It can be modified, but we cannot make it any less stringent than what DNR and FEMA require. We also have to adopt flood storage districts. These are relatively new. They're not a FEMA requirement, but this is a DNR requirement, and as I'll show on the map, it really doesn't affect a lot of buildable area in the city of Mequon. And then finally, the Little Menominee study. That's the blue I mentioned before on that one map and the final map. That area was not part of the 2007 FEMA maps. It's not part of the 2024 FEMA maps, but there was a study completed by SewerPAC a number of years ago that was approved by DNR that has not yet been submitted to FEMA, So we're incorporating that into our adoption of the ordinance so that we have some protection for that area. Impacts to the community. Flood designations expanded in some areas. So I do have a map here, the lower left-hand corner map, this one here. This one shows yellow lines, and it shows where the elevation change from our proposed to our, from the current maps to the proposed maps have changed. So some of these areas, especially along the Thiensville Bend in the river, have gone up about 1.5 feet. Some areas to the north actually went down a little bit, and some areas remain the same. And then as you get closer to the county line, it actually went up about 0.7 feet. Existing lomas and loma RF superseded in some cases. So if you had a loma in the past, you'll either be revalidated or you'll be superseded, and that's what this map shows. So everybody on this map in green has had a loma, and those will be revalidated. That means you were out of the floodplain before, and based on the new maps, you're out of the floodplain now. If your color is red, that means you have been superseded. That means you are no longer out of the floodplain based on the proposed change of the elevation. The biggest area that we see a lot of the changes are occurring is kind of in the River Barn Park area. In this area located here, there are some red and some green in the same actual areas. Again, a new stipulation of our ordinance is if you have a loma, you're exempted from state floodplain requirements. So if you do have a loma, then you're allowed. There's no longer a 50% requirement. There's no longer dry land access requirements. You can build as any if you were outside the floodplain completely, which is relatively new to the city of Mequon. Impacts to existing non-conforming buildings. Act 175 language. So there's a new requirement that was adopted by the state's legislature a couple years ago that says if you meet certain requirements and you're in the floodplain, you're not limited to the 50% value for improvements. What this means is that for years, if you're in the floodway or flood fringe, you're limited to 50% of the improvement value of your property for structural improvements over the life of the property. Now, Act 175 says if you elevate your property and you meet other requirements, you're no longer bound by that 50% rule. This is relatively big for people in the floodway because you can't really elevate out of the floodway. But if you elevate your property and you get your first floor above 1 foot above and your basement floor is above the base flood elevation, then you're not bound by that 50% rule. And in the past, we've had people elevate. They were in the floodway, but then they would still be bound by the 50% rule, and they could only expand their building so much. So this is a big change for the city of Mequon, and this was kind of pushed through the state legislature, and then DNR finally accepted it. Flood versus non-flood disaster. There's also language in this code that allows for non-flood disaster buildings to be rebuilt in the floodway. This is also somewhat new. If you're damaged by a flood, over 50% of your value, you're not allowed to be rebuilt. If you get damaged by a lightning or a tornado or some other natural event, you are allowed to rebuild as long as you meet the requirements of the ordinance. So that's something new, and that's, I think, beneficial for a lot of people, especially in the floodway areas. Incorporate substantial damage and substantial improvements. Now, this is a downside. So under FEMA's requirements, if you do maintenance on your property, they look at it on a per event basis of what you can do at any given time with regard to the 50% rule. So for example, if your house, say your improvements on your house are worth $100,000, you can only spend $50,000 on maintenance on a per event basis, which they didn't really define. Well, we're taking it as any time you get a permit, it would be per event. So if, say example, you wanted to put a new roof on your house, and you wanted to side your house, if you did them at the same time and that cost exceeded the 50% rule, you technically couldn't do that. If you split them up into two separate permits and do it at 2 separate times, then you technically could do that. This is going to be really difficult for us to enforce because we don't even issue roofing permits for the city of Mequon. Now we're going to be required to in the floodplain. And for other things like siding, we issue permits for it, but we never really applied it to the 50% rule because the 50% rule only typically required to structural improvements. So we have to actually keep two kind of separate logs, one for maintenance and one for structural improvements. Now the maintenance is a per event basis, it's not cumulative, but the other one is. So it's really gonna kind of be a new thing for us to try to enforce. And we're not gonna go out there looking for people, but just so you know, as a homeowner, if you're in the floodplain, you will need permits for basically anything you do on your property. Common Council decisions. So we addressed this with the Common Council, and they're looking to take formal action on this ordinance in the maps on June 11th in order to beat the July 31st deadline. They had a conversation whether we want to remain in the NFIP or not, and they decided to remain in. They wanted to protect our homeowners that do have federally backed flood insurance, so they made that decision. They did decide to adopt the Act 175 provisions. That means that you'll be allowed to take advantage of that rule if you decide to elevate your properties. It was a voluntary requirement. Some communities didn't adopt it. They wanted to not allow it so that those houses eventually go away, but I think our common council felt that there was too much value in those properties to let them be restricted in terms of development. We are not adopting the CRS requirements. The community rating system allows you to get a break on your flood insurance, but the city would have to do a certain number of things to get that break, and one of them was to require higher standards in terms of development, and the council felt that was just too onerous to take on for the residents of the community. We also will need to modify our current zoning districts. Currently, we have zoning districts are zoned floodplain, floodway, flood fringe that do not match our current FEMA maps and do not match our proposed FEMA maps. And we have different regulations for them, so we'll have to conflate all that together at one point. Now, we won't probably do this for a while, but you'll eventually you would get a notification from us because this is a zoning change again. So you would, if you're questioning why you'd get that, that's what it would be. One of the reasons why is that we're changing these maps to match our zoning district with the FEMA maps. Finally, and probably the most important, the Common Council has made a decision that they're interested in reviewing the model that came up with these maps at a future date. One of the biggest issues we've seen is that they use a flow rate that is inconsistent with what we've seen in terms of flood events. At the Pioneer Station river gauge, at a 100-year storm event, they used a 14,000 and change cubic feet per second flow rate during a flood event. We've looked at our major floods all the way back to the 90s, and we haven't seen a flow rate exceeding about 7,000. So we're questioning why they use such a large number in their model, and we really haven't got a good answer on that. There's other things that we saw in the model that we don't understand. I mean, I've spoke with other people in the early session about anecdotal evidence about I've lived here 30, 40 years, I haven't seen flooding. I think that's a common theme. So there's got to be something that's causing these issues to be inaccurate. So there's something in the model that we want to see. So what we'll end up doing is we'll either ask DNR to revisit the model. If they choose not to, then we would end up having to hire someone, an engineer or a scientist to remodel the area and see if we can get a different result. And if we do that, we'd have to resubmit to FEMA for basically a letter and map revision that would then change the adopted maps that we would have to adopt by July 31st. There's no way we're going to be able to have an engineer look at these models and revalidate them before July 31st. So this is something that will take some time after the fact. Again, I mentioned Act 175. Basically, the two main provisions are if your living quarters are above the flood protection elevation, which is 2 feet above the base flood elevation, and your lowest floor elevation is elevated to the base flood elevation, you're not bound by the 50% rule. This doesn't matter if it doesn't matter if you have dry land access or if you're in the floodway. You can get out of the 50% rule, and I think this will be helpful for a lot of people that choose to go down this path. There are other requirements that you have to meet, but these are the most stringent ones. So if you elevate your house up and you elevate your basement up, you can pretty much do what else you want on that property. Now, if you expand the property in the floodway, you still have to have an H&H study done to show that there's no impact on the floodway, but anything within the four walls of your house you can do without limitation, which I think is a big change. So impacts of the 24, these are going to be hard to see on the screen, so I did print some of these out. So basically this map in the lower right corner here, that shows the change of the floodplain. So anywhere where you see red on that map, those are new areas that were not in the floodplain before. And the biggest area I see is kind of down again by River Barn Park, and some areas along the other parts of the Milwaukee River have gone up. And then the decrease, there's very little in decrease. I didn't print on a map for this one, but there's just a little bit of area kind of in the northwest portion of pointing it on the mouse. I'm not sure how well you can see that on the screen. But there's a little area up in the northwest part of the city that showed a decrease in the flood area, mostly A-zone properties. So this shows, this is the map that you show in the corner. This has all the elevation data on the existing and proposed. It's got a lot of information on it. I could help you guide individually if you want after the session to kind of show you where your property's at and how this impacts you. But this is basically all the information of the proposed versus the existing with elevation data, and it has the luminometry on there as well. This map up in the upper left-hand corner of the fort, that is our map that shows the change of the floodway extent. Now, the most significant portion of this property is down in here, again, by Lacticours, by River Road, and across the street, across from River Barn Park. This area was not designated floodway before, and now it is. And this is one of these other issues that I think we have with the model. It doesn't make sense for some of that area to be floodway. Again, as I said before, the floodway is the path of flowing water during a flood event. And I don't know how many of you live in that area. I know that it does flood, but I don't see a lot of flowing water. It's mostly backwater from the river. So that's another area I think we need to focus on, is why this got so severe. And then finally, this map on the bottom is the base flood elevation change. So there's yellow hatch marks wherever you see them on the river that has a number associated with it. If the number is negative, the floodplain in that area went down. If it's positive, then the number went up. So the biggest change, again, is kind of around this bend. It went up about 1.5 feet. Areas up in here actually went down a little bit, or were at zero, and then down to the south, some of these areas went up 7/10, 8/10 of a foot. I was also told that the reason some of those areas went up is because to the south of us in Milwaukee County, they've had modeling done more recent than ours, and theirs was higher than ours. So in order to not have a reverse waterfall, basically, they had to raise our numbers up to match. I'm not sure exactly why that is and why they didn't take that into consideration at the time, but that's the information I got from DNR. This map up here shows the letter of map changes, which I spoke with before. So basically, if you're green, you're revalidated. You don't have to worry about being in the floodplain. If you're red, that means you've been superseded. So there's other data that they found that shows that you should not be you should be in the floodplain based on the elevation of your property. And I can explain that in more detail individually if you guys have questions about that. Again, flood storage district, this just shows the map of the area. There's just a really small area kind of near Trinity Creek. Most of that area is wetlands. There's very little upland property there that was impacted by it, but it's something we have to adopt as part of our ordinance with the DNR. And then finally, this is just an example to show the difference between zoning and FEMA. This shows a whole different number of different lines with different symbols. This just shows that there's a lot of variation between our zoning maps and our floodplain maps when it comes to boundary and lines. And some of them are more subtle, but some of them are fairly distinct in location. So we'll have to clean this all up at a future date. So with that, I'll take any questions if you have. If you want to, again, individual sign up is on the wall for properties that you want more detailed information with. We have certain dates selected at certain times. You can sign up for those. Or if you want to stick around, I could try to answer your questions as best as possible on an individual basis. But if you have any questions regarding the general framework of that, I'm willing to take them now. Yes, well, I think they're recording this presentation so you can watch it again if you'd like. A lot of this information is not available in one specific location. It's kind of all over the place. So we'll try to consolidate some of this information and put it on the website with the floodplain map that we put on there. It's just really hard to see some of that stuff at the scale of a computer, but we'll do our best to try to get more information out there as possible. Marty? Or AE is modeled floodplain, so they actually incorporated those in the model, and there's a base flood elevation associated with that. A zone is typically unmodeled, which means that some of the areas don't have a base flood elevation. So if you have a property that has an A zone designation, what we typically do is we'll look at a contour map of existing contours, and we'll try to determine what that base flood elevation is by the contours, and then we'll establish one. And that's typically fine for like a single off property. Now, if you were going to do a large subdivision development in an A zone property, you might have to go through and model that yourself to determine where that line is. But for smaller 1 or 2 home developments, that would be something we would handle at a staff level. Does that make sense? Sort of. Well, it's quite interesting. They use what's called the HEC-RAS model, and most models are only good as your inputs, and so during this process we questioned how they came up with the modeling, especially this 14,000 cubic feet per second at the Pioneer Station. And what I was told was that there's 2 parts of the modeling: is a hydraulic and hydronic. or hydraulic and hydrology. So they only did the hydrology. They did not do hydraulic changes. So they used the data from the previous study, 2007, for that elevation data. But then when we dug into it a little deeper, the 2007 data was used the 91 data. So, and the 91 data, that Pioneer Station wasn't even active for like 3 or 4 years at the time. So they didn't really trust the numbers coming out of it. So they actually used the data from the Estabrook Park station, and then they interpolated upstream to determine what that number was. So they actually never looked at the actual Pioneer gauge and used the data that we've had now for 20, 30 years into that model. And that's one of the concerns we're having with the way they did things. So, again, a model's only good as what you could put into it and what you put out of it. The other issue is that FEMA and DNR have different requirements on how they evaluate what a floodway is. In FEMA's requirements, a floodway, basically they build in a foot of surcharge, which is called. So if you're in the flood fringe, you're technically allowed to fill on that property. So as the more you fill, then the floodway gets higher. So at 1 foot, they stop and say, okay, wherever that 1 foot is, that's where we're going to determine the floodway. In the state of Wisconsin, we have a zero surcharge. They determine floodway boundary by effective flow versus ineffective flow. And they do this in the model, and even in the model itself, it says this is a very subjective way of doing things. So we think there's a lot of leeway or a lot of potential changes that could be made to a model to show us what exactly is going on in Mequon versus what they're showing is going on in Mequon. Because there are certain areas, I've been here since 2008, there are certain areas that I have not seen flood that are in the floodplain, and there's areas that I have seen flood. And there's really no rhyme or reason to how they developed this model and how it relates to what's actually out in the field. So that's something we're hoping to look for in the future. Yes. It depends on what your concern is, if it's financial or if it's developableness or developability. So if financial, I would say there are people that are along shoreline that were always in the floodway, they're still in the floodway, but now their elevation, base flood elevation went up a foot, 1.2 feet or 1.5 feet in height. So from a developability standpoint, there doesn't change much. But from a insurance rate, it might, because now that you're less compliant, your rates may go up because they base it on risk. So they may say, since your house is 3 foot below the floodplain elevation instead of 2.5 feet, your rate just went up. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it, I would say, in terms of being able to develop, my biggest concern would be, again, the area across the street from River Barn Park here. This was never floodway before. That was always this flood fringe. So you technically could fill in the flood fringe. So people in there still could add on to their houses. They could do things. Now, being in the floodway, it adds a whole nother level of detail to what they can and can't do. So, and the same, I guess I focused on the one area, but even across the street between the river on River Road and Lac Cours, that area was hit pretty hard too, and has all been added to the floodway. Now, other areas, there might be some individual properties, but from a group area, that's, I think, what the biggest impacts would be. No, well, again, the city doesn't regulate the insurance rates, so that's through FEMA. I think the time frame is gonna be how quickly we can get a contract with someone to evaluate it, and how long it's gonna take them to go through the process. My guess is it's gonna be 6 months to a year to do that. Um, Yeah, I agree, but there's really not much we can do about it because there's no way possible to have somebody review that model and do an analysis and get FEMA to sign off on it by July 31st. It's just not possible. Even back in January when we had this discussion, January and February, at staff and at our council meeting, that still wasn't enough time. I mean, unfortunately, FEMA had these draft maps available years ago, but they had a. I'm sure I could ask how many would have notified of the FEMA public hearing. I'm sure nobody was here because they didn't notify anybody, and they had it virtual because it was at the tail end of COVID, so it was done virtually at the county, and we were not really only one I think it was identified. It was our mayor received a letter at one point letting us know, but we didn't have any data at that time, so. This has been. They're going to say, "Well, this has been going on a while," but we just finally got the information in January about what the impact is to our area. Because when you look at the map, especially like in this area here, when you look at this map, the blue to red doesn't really change that much. So you think, well, there's really no impact, but there's a 1.5 foot impact. And that's the other question I ask of them is, how can it raise 1.5 feet and it doesn't expand? Yeah, it doesn't expand. How can that? Unless you're in a valley, that doesn't make sense. And they said, well, we have better survey data than we did before. But I'm like, well, it can't be coincidental that the survey is more accurate just to the extent of the floodplain. There's got to be something going on there. So, well, logic and I don't want to go down that path, but there was something from FEMA that basically said that there are no exceptions to adoption. If you don't adopt by the 31st, you are suspended from the program and no exceptions. So I don't think we can go down. We can try, we can put pressure politically on it, but I don't think we can. I don't think we'll be successful down that path. Unfortunately, yes. Yes. It means your property is, but it doesn't mean your house is. So if you're doing work on your house, adding on to your house, you're not impacted. Now, if you put an addition on and you want to go into that area, then that's a different story. And the impact is different whether it's floodway or flood fringe. If it's flood fringe, you would just have to elevate and you get a fill permit, and it's really not that big of a process because you can't increase the flood elevation by a hundredth of a foot. You'll never do that on an individual property. If it's in a floodway, it's a different story. Then you'd have to do a H&H study, and you have to determine that there's no impact to the floodway, and that's a little bit more costly of an adventure and more difficult to get approved. So a letter of map amendment is typically we don't get involved in letter of map amendments. What you do is you basically hire a surveyor, and there's a couple of surveyors locally that understand the process. They've done these before, so they'll come out and survey the property. And again, it's all based on elevation data. So they'll take the base foot elevation, they'll take your house lowest grade of your first floor level, and they'll determine whether you're in or out. And if you're out, then they'll send it to FEMA. FEMA looks at it and they review it and they approve it. And they send you in and they send us a copy of the letter of map amendment. It's the only time the city has to sign off on it if there's a change to the floodway boundary or something in the floodway, then we have to sign off on it. But we still rely on the engineer who did the work to verify. We just double check it. Anyone else? Well, you're more than welcome. I'll be here until our next presentation. Oh, sorry, one more. Yes. I've been with the city since 2006. I've been in this position unofficially since 2008. Yes. I was here for that. Yes, the 2008 flooding. Well, I was. I mean, all not all flooding events are exactly the same. We had a big flood in 12, I think, and in 15. Now those were floods that occurred Cedarburg Grafton area where they had a heavy rain, and it came down and the river expanded here, but we didn't get the same level of precipitation. The 2008 we got double whammy. I think we got both. But there were still areas, I mean, 2008 it was bad. There was a lot of areas that were inundated with water, but there were areas that were still in the floodplain that did not get water. And we also, I think, predating my time here, but 97 was a big flood here as well, which a lot of people, I think, remember that one as well. And I understand it's tricky it all depends on when the rain falls and where it falls and what time of the year it is and how saturated the ground is. So I know models can be varying in terms of their accuracy, but the interesting part about what the FEMA did with this or what DNR did with this latest modeling, they did not look at that portion of it. They did not look at the hydrology of it. So they did not look at rainfall events. They took the old model for that. So I don't know if that would impact it one way or another. But I know from the fact that I've been here since 2008, and people have told me that have been here, living here 30, 40 years, that certain areas just don't flood and certain areas do. And I think all we're looking for is just to get a better, more accurate representation of what actually occurs. We're not ignoring the fact that we get flooding and we get water, but we're just trying to make sure that it's accurate and fair. Okay, if there are no other questions, I'll be here again. If you have specific questions, I'll be here all day until 7 o'clock tonight. So if you want to, there's other staff members that might be able to help you as well, but probably going to be me.